Hi everyone, my name is Ali Davis, founder of mediatoracademy.com. If you're a conflict resolution practitioner and want to develop your thinking, learn brand new skills, or even sharpen old ones, then this is the place for you. We track down thought leaders and experienced practitioners and for 60 minutes try and get answers to some pretty big questions so that you can improve your effectiveness, develop your thinking, and stay on top of your game. Now, my guest today is a lecturer on law at Harvard Law School and founder of Triad Consulting Group, who have a pretty impressive list of corporate clients. Now, she typically works with executive teams, helping them work through conflict, repair working relationships, and make sound decisions together. In the public sector, she has also provided training for the New England Organ Bank, the Singapore Supreme Court, the Obama White House, and theologians struggling with disagreement over the nature of truth and God. She has spent the last 20 years with the Harvard Negotiation Project, developing negotiation theory and practice, and she specialises in particularly difficult negotiations where emotions run high and relationships become strained. She is co-author of the New York Times business bestsellers Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most, and Thanks for the Feedback, The Science and Art of Receiving Feedback Well, even when it's off base, unfair, poorly delivered, and frankly, you're just not in the mood. Now, I should say that she's appeared on shows as diverse as Oprah and the G. Gordon Liddy Show, NPR's Diane Reeves Show, Fox News, and CNBC's Power Lunch, obviously to prepare for this interview today. It's such a privilege for me to welcome Sheila Heen onto Mediator Academy. Sheila, welcome.
Well, thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
I feel like a child in a sweet shop. You know, I've got $1 to spend, and I've got so many questions that I need to choose wisely.
And there'll be health effects apparently down the line for you.
So here's my thinking, right? I'm curious about difficult negotiations, and in the intro it says you work particularly with difficult negotiations where emotions run high and relationships are strained. So I thought we could start there, find out what makes these sorts of conversations sticky, difficult, tough, how we get stuck, and so on. Then I thought we could look at the role of the mediator through the lens of difficult conversations, thinking about our approach, thinking about what's going on for the parties, sitting around the table, and how we get them engaged in a productive dialogue, in a useful conversation. You know, it's certainly one of the things that I think about. I think it's important to frame those sorts of conversations as mutual learning conversations. So, you know, I'll be interested in your thoughts around that.
Yeah.
Then I really want to understand how we can give and receive feedback on the basis that I believe the Co-Mediation Model is an effective model and an important one in the interest of mediator accountability. We talked about this in the pre-interview. So how do we really do that well? How do we hold ourselves accountable for our behavior and our colleagues' behavior and do that in a way that's kind of in the spirit of learning? You know, because I know whilst there's a part of me that is, fully believe that feedback is useful, will enhance my effectiveness, there's also a little part of me that just wants to know that I'm a good boy and I'm doing everything right. You know, so
yes. Well, I'm impressed that it's just a little part of you, right? For sure. And I think especially for smart, accomplished people, right? Feedback is threatening.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. So that agenda sound okay with you?
Absolutely.
I'm also very proud of the fact that I've never once stuck to an agenda like that.
Excellent. So everyone will give us feedback on whether we did what we said we were going to do.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
Yeah. All right. So let's jump straight in. What makes a negotiation or a conversation difficult, sticky, uncomfortable, you know?
Yeah, so let me say a little bit about how we came to it, because there's a historical answer, and then there's an obvious answer. So the obvious answer is if the conversation feels difficult to you, if it's keeping you up at night, if you have tried to have it before and it hasn't gone the way that you wanted, if it's causing you anxiety, fear, frustration, unhappy outcomes, or you're avoiding it, it's difficult. So it's very much an experiential definition. That's the simple one.
Okay.
The historical one really has to do with the work of the Harvard Negotiation Project. So when I showed up there in 1990, dating myself, we were teaching from Getting to Yes. Roger Fisher was running the program, and people were coming and taking our courses, and from all over the world for the exec ed, as well as the regular graduate students. And periodically they'd come back and they'd say, hey, I just want to tell you how I'm using this great approach and focusing on interests and creating options, and whether I'm a negotiator or I'm a mediator, this is incredibly helpful, and let me tell you about the impact it's having. But every once in a while, people would come back and say, your approach is really helpful in many ways, but there are some conversations I'm in where when I try to use your approach, it's not working. In fact, I think it might be making things worse. And, Harvard being Harvard, we had a reaction that I think is typical, which was, well, if our theory isn't working for you, obviously there's something wrong with you, right? I mean,
that's exactly my thought then.
You probably need a remedial course, or maybe you need to hire us as consultants, right? And we'll come and show you how it's done. But I think eventually we kind of came to our senses and thought, maybe there's something different about particularly challenging conversations. Getting to Yes talks about separating the people from the problem. In these cases, it seemed the people were the problem.
Okay.
Often there's a lot of history involved. We don't trust each other enough to have an open conversation about interests. We feel like we're really backed into a corner, and it's not my fault that I'm backed into a corner. It's your fault because you're impossible. So we just started inviting people to bring in their toughest conversations, and we started to take them apart to understand, okay, so what's getting people stuck and why is it so hard to make any progress? And what, difficult conversations captured what we learned over the course of about 10 years. I mean, it took us a very long time, we're very slow learners, to feel like we had it right, or close enough to right that you could actually pick up that book and use the approach and it would help you get somewhere in your own difficult conversations.
Okay, yeah. So were there, the people that were coming back saying, look, it's working for some, it's not working for others, were there common themes about were they particular types of conversations, or were there elements within the conversations?
Yeah. So the first working title of the book, Difficult Conversations, was the 10 hardest things to say and how to say them. Because our first hypothesis was, well, we're hearing themes in the kinds of conversations. So we'll just have a chapter about each of them. Yeah. So there's, giving feedback. There's dealing with a peer where you don't have any authority, but you're trying to influence them. There's conversations at home with your spouse. There's conversations with your teenager. There's conversations about difficult topics like politics or religion or strongly held views. And so that actually was our first mental organization. Yeah. And then we started to listen to the kinds of things people were thinking and feeling during these conversations, right? What we eventually called the internal voice. And it pretty quickly became apparent that actually it didn't matter who they were talking to, and it didn't matter what they were talking about, because the same kinds of things show up. Okay. That all of us have a story about what's happening or what has happened or what should happen that includes what we're right about and whose fault it is. Yep. And why that other person is acting this way, their intentions or their character. And that everybody is grappling with strong feelings. And this was actually a pretty late insight that came from Doug, that if a conversation feels difficult, there's something about identity that feels like it's at stake. It says something about the kind of person you are, which is then driving the depth and scope of the feelings that then influence the story that we're telling, so that they interact together. But once we kind of saw that actually it's not organized by subject, it's organized by what our internal voice is typically doing, that really set the agenda, which is, in order to handle these conversations better, you have to change from the inside out. So it's not about a script and saying magic words. It's about changing your internal stance in the conversation and first negotiating with yourself.
Something you said about identity then. I got the impression that is central to the struggles that people have. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, so identity can be big or small in terms of the hook, but what's interesting about it is that even when it's small, and it can be true or not true. In other words, even if it's small and I'm pretty sure it's not true, the fact that you think this about me is especially upsetting, right? So, and we all have a few traits that we kind of wrap our identity around. Like if I'm nothing else, I'm really responsible, or I'm really responsive to clients, or I'm, kind or empathetic, or I'm very thorough. So what you get from me is going to be right, down to the nth detail. So that means that if I do something that isn't 100% right, and I overlooked something, the suggestion that, oh my gosh, I can't believe I made that mistake. What must they think of me? What do I think about myself? And particularly for high achievers, I think identity can be even more brittle because we hold ourselves to such high standards. So the identity lens can help you understand why certain kinds of conversations feel difficult to you, but they're not hard to others. So this is part of what gave us this insight, is that we were puzzling over the observation that some kinds of conversations are predictably difficult for everyone, like firing someone. But have you noticed that there are a few people who actually don't have trouble with that? Yeah. And there are ranges of how hard that feels. Some people have a really hard time saying no when they're asked for help. Other people have no trouble, right? So we were puzzling over why that was, and hit upon this as we talked with people about why they felt stuck. If you have trouble saying no, you're probably someone who's a real team player. You'd never abandon someone in need. So turning down a friend who asks for help, or a colleague, isn't just saying the words no, it's doing something that is not who you are or want to be.
So the conflict with our own identity, or that with our sense of self.
Yes. Yeah. And by the way, this is tough for mediators, because it's really easy to get your identity wrapped around either how happy are the parties with you afterwards, or what's your settlement rate.
Yeah. And
because there isn't a lot of oversight in the midst of a conflict where you can't figure out what to do, and these parties are they're further away from settling than when they walk through your door. Yeah. Maybe you've actually made it worse. That is a really tough identity issue. Should it be? Not necessarily. These parties maybe shouldn't settle.
Okay. I had a thought a moment ago. If I'm going in as a mediator into a particular conflict, I've got one on the burner at the moment, and I'm continuously changing my approach. I'm continuously changing the way I engage parties. So one of the things that I might say, I'm aware that I have that expectation of myself to be really effective and to help these people solve their problems, right? Even though I know that it's down to them to do it, and I'm just there to help them have a good quality conversation. There's a part of me that I want to be able to walk out and go, I really helped these. I earned my fee. To put it crudely, I'm thinking one of the things that might be helpful for me to say is to kind of share that dilemma with the parties, Is that, how do we overcome this identity struggle then?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So, two thoughts. In terms of sharing the struggle, one of the things that I have sometimes started doing up front is to frame my role pretty specifically and to say, your job is to come as you are. You don't have to pretend you think or feel anything different. And by the way, I should say something about the kind of mediation that I do, because a lot of the mediation I do is what we call uncontained mediation, which gives it the aura of an extreme sport. But what we mean by that is that we think of contained mediation as often court annexed.
Right.
So you already know who the parties are, you know what the issues in dispute are, you know how much time you're going to spend, at least initially, trying to mediate it, etc. In uncontained mediation, half of the project is often figuring those questions out. Who are the players who I need to talk to even understand what the issues are?
Yeah. And
then who should be at the table? And by the way, how do we structure that process? Because it's not necessarily everybody for the whole time.
Yeah.
We may be sequencing.
Yeah.
So in terms of framing my role to get buy-in for people to even participate in that process, rather than saying we're going to see if we can settle this or find a solution, what I've started saying a few years ago is, my job is to help you guys have a candid and high quality conversation so that at the end of the day, you either find a solution or an outcome or you don't. But if you don't, it's not because you didn't communicate well. So we're trying to remove the communication barrier.
Yeah.
So that we can then actually just deal with all the other challenges and barriers here. And at the other end, ideally you have better working relationships even if you still don't agree or have a solution.
Yeah.
Which will help you down the line. So for me, being transparent, it is almost a reminder to me as much as to them that settlement isn't the only outcome, but there are some other benefits of the process.
Yeah.
And we're figuring it out together, whether there is something to be agreed upon and acted upon.
Yeah.
But I think that there's a second identity thing, at least for me, and you can say whether this is true for you, which is, when I was little, I looked at all the grown-ups and at least if they were good at their job, I assumed that they were in a state of sort of knowing and confidence all the time. I think it's taken me a really long time to feel comfortable with the fact that a lot of the time, particularly in a challenging mediation, let's say, I sit in a state of thinking to myself, I have no idea what I'm doing here. And I have no idea what to try next because this is not working. Or, so-and-so would know what to do here, but I don't. And sometimes I'm asking myself, what would Doug do here? Or what would John do here? Just to try to push my own boundaries of what I can even think of.
Yeah.
But I think that state of feeling out of your depth and uncertain that you're up to the task itself is an identity issue, right?
Yeah.
Where I feel triggered like, well, if they'd hired somebody who knew what they were doing, they would be a lot better shape. Even as intellectually I know, there aren't that many people in the world. We're a small community who have this much experience trying to help people.
Yeah. So you've got, it's not just me then. That's good to know.
It's you and me, but everybody watching this totally knows what they're doing.
So what do you do then? I'm throwing the agenda right out the window for a moment.
Oh, good, excellent.
What do you do when you have that internal voice that says, "Oh my God, I haven't got a clue. I have to present this calm, knowing sort of expression inside your paddling,
Yeah. Yeah, in some ways, it's almost like you have two choices. You can try to fool them by appearing and acting as if oh yeah, I meant for that to happen. This is really good. When you're thinking, oh shoot, that was the wrong question to ask. That took us down a rabbit hole. Or I think often it's better to be transparent, as you were saying.
Yeah.
And I have definitely said to parties, either in joint session or in caucus, look, I'm at a little bit of a loss here because it feels like we're pretty stuck. Mm-hmm. And I can't tell whether that's because there really isn't room here to come to agreement and it is better off for you to walk away, or whether we're missing something and there is a solution that would help you guys move to a better place or whatever the issue might be. And I often think that move, my experience has been that move actually often shares the responsibility with the parties. Because otherwise they're content to sit back. What are you going to do next to solve this? What I want you to do next is go browbeat the other person. Because clearly I'm right and this is their fault. But by sharing the dilemma that you feel you're in, I think you share responsibility for thinking about what might help.
Yeah. Okay, so that's helpful.
And you get them to do your job for you, see? Yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think I would do that, although I would then, I would then find myself, if I happen to find myself in the mediation at a later stage, thinking the same thought, I'd then be thinking, I can't say that I don't know what to do again, because then I definitely look incompetent.
Yeah. Well, I think one question is also what's the persona that you bring into the room? And so it has to be congruent with that persona. And I think so there may be two things that maybe make it easier for me to constantly tell people I don't know what I'm doing. So I don't want to give that impression, but certainly when we're stuck, I don't mind saying it a few times, right? Or sometimes I'll just say out loud, so I'm debating because there are a couple different directions we can go from here. Yeah. And so I'm thinking about which is going to be more helpful or more valuable at this stage. Yeah. And so if I'm being transparent and sharing throughout sort of choice points, part of mediation, as we all know, is to try to help equip them to solve their own problems going forward, either with each other or with other people. But I also bring a lot of humor into the room because I think that it can help break tension and it can help us step away and sort of self-observe in tough moments. And so, you have to be careful about humor. So it really usually needs to be self-directed. So if I can make a joke about feeling stuck myself or thinking, okay, well, that wasn't what I expected to happen at the right moment. It's a way for us to step out and sort of self-observe. Okay. You have to be careful about it. It's not that I'm telling them I'm not taking this seriously.
Yeah, no, sure.
But, we might as well enjoy the time that we're going to spend together, given how stressful it is for the parties to be in the room. Yeah. So.
Okay.
It's a theory of humor as well.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about some of the ideas and frameworks in the different conversations, and I wondered how much does that influence you in the way you approach your mediations? If I'm bouncing up and down, by the way, I'm sitting on a Swiss ball.
Nice.
I've thrown my office chair out and I'm moved to the Swiss ball posture.
Excellent. See, that was nice transparency.
Yeah. Well, I just thought.
I thought you were just excited.
Okay, composure. So I'm wondering, how much does that influence how you approach, how you think about, so I'm thinking specifically about the 3 conversations, for example.
Mm-hmm. Well, for better and for worse, it is a huge influence because, of course, my brain now is organized in this way, right? So it's both, we all get stuck in our own mindsets. And my map is certainly very influenced, right? Where I'm thinking, I'm working really hard to paraphrase, to turn accusations and judgments into feelings, right? To reframe when I paraphrase.
Uh-huh.
I'm working really hard to help them move from blame to contribution. So it sounds like that didn't help, and you were reacting to that. Talk to me over here about your response or what you feel like you've contributed to the problem. So it's certainly underlying the architecture of what I'm trying to do.
Okay.
And the danger is that I miss things because, of course, we see what we're expecting to see. But I'm also using a vocabulary that is different than their usual vocabulary in sort of subtle ways, which can disrupt their story a little bit.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the story then, because we've got 3 different stories going on, right? Got the what happened, the emotions, and the identity. Are those the stories that we've got running around?
We do, and then within what happened, they each have a very different story about what happened, and certainly what should happen, which is why we're here.
Yeah.
Right. And so a lot of the explicit conversation is going on inside the what happened conversation. Some of the feelings and identity stuff is happening beneath the surface, and I'm nudging it out or referencing it a little bit along the way, but it depends on the situation and the purpose. So a big piece of what I'm trying to do is listen for what are they each pretty sure they're right about.
Yeah.
And it's not always true for sure, but it's the most common pattern in my experience is that they are each right about what they think this is about.
Okay.
So you're moving pretty quickly into an and world. In other words, one of the examples we give in the book is we're not, from my point of view, we're not arguing about what the contract says. We can both read what it says. We're arguing about what we each expected, or given changed circumstances, the interpretation that we each have. So I'm listening for parties to be able to say, so it sounds like when you signed it, you were pretty sure that the market was going to change in the following way, and you assumed that that would mean the price would adjust or whatever it would be. And it sounds like you assumed that one of the reasons you agreed to this term was because it was fixed. So we're in an and world, which is as you came in, you are right about what you each assumed, and that it is now a problem. Okay,
so I know when you say an and world, I know what you mean when you say that. Could you explain what you mean when you say that?
Yeah. So we started to notice that a big piece of what we were using in trying to help and coach people is shifting them from thinking of the world as but to and. Because in any argument, dispute, conflict, I make my point about why I'm right, and you say, yeah, but here's what's really true. And the but is a hinge that sort of cancels the first part of the sentence. I love you, honey, but the important part is what's to come.
Yeah.
When in fact, the reality is usually an and world, which is this is true, and our dilemma is this is also true, and so what do we do? And so helping people say, you can believe that I let you down or was liable or whatever, and I can believe that I actually did adhere to the expectations, or that your expectations were unreasonable, and now what do we do about that? So that I don't have to give up my story, although it will start to be modified by that and.
Yeah.
In order to actually be present or come to agreement.
Okay, so you, by when you say it being in an and world, you're acknowledging that both stories are valid and can coexist alongside each other. What you try to do is in the words of I interviewed a narrative mediator, narrative therapist.
Totally.
He talked about enriching the narrative. Rather than it being a thin narrative, which is a fairly one-dimensional story,
yes,
you try and expand on the story, bringing in different elements so the story changes shape, grows, becomes bigger, therefore creating more possibility.
And you create a narrative that is inclusive of many of the most important things that each party feels strongly about, I think.
Yeah.
We talk about a third story.
Okay.
So that you can have a narrative that is more complete. So I totally agree with this guy about the narrative being a huge piece of what you are negotiating with each party.
Yeah.
And so you're looking for a narrative that includes what they feel is most important about who they are and what this situation represents in their life, and which includes a possible outcome that doesn't mean they have to give up key pieces of their story in order to say yes to it.
Yeah, okay.
To live with it and to repeat it to people who say what happened.
Yeah. So the third story is a story made up of parts of what one party thinks, parts of what the other party thinks, and other information that gets put into the pot during the course of the discussion.
Yeah, and often the headline on that narrative is very simple. You know, it's things like, so it sounds like you guys had very different assumptions coming in, and that's gotten you guys in quite a bit of trouble now, not surprisingly. And they will each say, yeah. Or it sounds like you guys had very different preferences about how to handle noise in the condo. Yeah. So it often includes the word difference and includes the word and. Different whatever. Assumptions, preferences, expectations, blah, 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 blah. And that third story is one that they can both sign on to.
Yeah.
That they feel like, I don't have to give up my view in order to participate in that. So now they've stepped into a shared narrative that helps us to work together. Figure out, okay, so given that narrative, what do we want to do about it?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? You know, as you're talking now, I can see how useful that just having those phrases at hand would be in a mediation. You know, so it sounds like you arrived here today with some expectations about X, Y, and Z, and it sounds like your expectations about X, Y, and Z were different.
Yeah.
From, you know.
Or it can be one, the narrative can be around feelings, right? So you're in a family business, you've got parties of the family business, and after listening and giving them a chance to say their story, you're saying, so, you know, Phil, it sounds like part of what this means to you is that you feel like you've gone totally out of your way, you have solved 105 problems for, you know, Susan over here, and that over time you felt really chronically underappreciated for that, and that the demands for what else you're going to solve have only increased. And Susan, it sounds like you actually often haven't wanted the help with your problems and feel like Bill is, you know, butting in and disrupting what you're trying to run. That he has been underappreciative of your ability to do it yourself or whatever, right? So I'm summarizing as an and it could be around feelings.
Yeah.
And it often includes a piece of feelings as well as just whatever the narrative that's at issue is, whether it's liability or responsibility or whatever it would be.
Yeah. Now you talk in the book about unexpressed feelings make it difficult for parties to listen, but also you say that it takes a toll on one's self-esteem.
Yeah.
Did I get that right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if that's been your experience, either for yourself or for others that you've helped.
I certainly think, you know, if I'm holding on to stuff, now whether they're feelings or whether they're, you know, if I'm not being transparent, I become preoccupied with my own thoughts, and that in itself makes it hard for me to listen.
I think, go ahead.
Yes, I'm trying to understand how it takes a toll on one's self-esteem.
So I think that a couple things happen when there are feelings about how you're feeling treated, or whatever, that you keep to yourself. That seeps in both directions being from the feelings conversation into the what happened conversation, and into the identity conversation. So it seeps into the what happened conversation because because of the impact on me emotionally of this problem between us, I start to attribute more and more negative intentions and character to you. I mean, clearly you're oblivious, or you don't care about me at all, or and it really starts to become a stark picture where this is just all your fault because you're such a terrible person, right? But I'm not going to change you because you're evil. So often when parties can't let go of blame, it's because of unexpressed feelings, actually.
Okay.
That have cemented that blame in place, because I feel like that person doesn't really understand why what they're doing is so awful. It'll seep now the other way into identity, because why am I letting myself be walked on? Why have I put up with this for so many years? What is wrong with me? I'm a doormat, right? And this is what we mean when we say unexpressed feelings can start to eat away.
Okay.
At the story you tell about who you are and whether you stick up for yourself in an important relationship.
Yeah.
And by the way, often other people will be telling you that, right? Like, why do you put up with this? And why have you done something about it? And so they have good intentions, but it can actually reinforce that sense of, I'm just a loser.
So as the mediator then, are we trying to bring those feelings to the surface, or not necessarily bring them to the surface, but help give people the space to express them? And if so, how do we do that? Do we tackle the blame to contribution, or do we address it from the identity perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so many mediators that I know and have worked with would say, look, when there's messy feelings around, like, you don't want to open that kind of worms really at all if you can avoid it. So you're going to try to work around them. And I was co-mediating a family business dispute a few years ago, and my co-mediator definitely had that view. And it was a situation where some of the shareholders who were family members needed to be bought out. They had staked the business, but now had big disputes with son-in-law who was running it. And I said, I don't think we'll find a solution if we don't deal with the feelings, because there's so little trust here, and there's so much anger and frustration and hurt and suspicion that they're not going to agree to any terms, because, well, if he would agree to them, they must not be fair. So I said, I think we just can't find a settlement unless we engage some of the relationship issues and try to improve those. And so in that case, I did something that I had not done before, which is, not only did I do individual conversations between the current guy running it, the son-in-law, and individual family members, but I also reached beyond those family members to their spouses. And I asked whether the spouses could come in to just meet with us, have breakfast with us as the mediators. Because I knew that these shareholders were going to go home and their spouses were going to say, well, what happened? You didn't agree to anything, did you? You can't trust him, he's snowing you, etc. And they needed to be familiar enough with the process and familiar enough with how we were going to find a solution, if there was one to be had, that they would trust the process, because they couldn't trust the players. Either their spouses, for not being a pushover, getting fooled again, or the folks on the other side. And so we did that, and we actually came in, they found a solution earlier than we had predicted and budgeted, but it was high risk, right? Because either now what you don't want to do is have people arguing about whether their feelings are justified, whether they should feel that way, etc. And I think that's what people worry about when you open that can of worms, as it's often called, which is it's actually just going to escalate. They're going to be arguing about the feelings. So that I think one of the keys for me is you don't have to agree that the other person should feel this way, or whether they should feel this upset about it, or whether what they are accusing you of doing and saying it was on purpose was on purpose. You don't have to agree with their story, but you do need to hear it.
So by inviting other family members in and giving them the opportunity to share what was going on for them.
Yeah, and ask questions about the process and who we are. Yeah.
Okay. It's an interesting strategy, isn't it? Because in my mind, I was thinking, how do I get these guys to express how they really feel? That was what I was thinking. How do I, so that once those feelings are out there, you can just do what you need to do. But it sounds like you had a different. What led you to take that approach?
The individual interviews with the shareholders, in those interviews, which we do by phone ahead of time, just so we can start to get a feel for the underlying architecture of the conflict. Just on the counter. Thanks. In those individual interviews, it became clear how big a role the spouses were playing.
Yeah.
And I had a little bit of history with this in a mediation where a lot of the mediation was one of the parties saying, well, my wife says I shouldn't do this, and my wife says I shouldn't do that. And the challenge with that is when you have parties outside the periphery of the mediation, and what they know about the conflict is the story their party tells. They're not there to hear that actually that thin, one-dimensional story really needs to be complexified. Yeah. They're outside just reinforcing that this person's getting snowed or whatever, so that I've got to find some way to connect them to that process. Otherwise, the difficult conversation the party has to have about settling is going to actually block anybody's ability to find a solution.
So there's a number of difficult conversations. There's a number of dynamics going on, isn't there? Not just between the parties, but between other decision makers that are not apparently party to the substantive aspects of the negotiation. Yeah,
I'm always asking, and maybe this is partly because of the uncontained part, where I'm thinking, who are the parties who feel that they should be at the table, or would want to be at the table, or who are going to demand to know why what was done at the table was done at the table. I'm really thinking about who do each of the parties have to talk to afterwards to justify or to implement what they just agreed to, or how they agreed to go forward.
Yeah.
And I've got to somehow reach out to influence those folks as well.
Yeah. Okay, look, I'm mindful of time. I've got one more question on this before we move on to feedback. And I guess the question is around creating a learning conversation. How do we engage parties in that? Given that, for the most part, I think people find it really difficult coming together to talk about painful things or things that are really tough, difficult, etc., etc. How do we create that spirit, or what are the kinds of things that we could say to parties to set the frame? You talked earlier about being clear about how you describe your role to set those sorts of expectations, but what can we do to create that learning conversation?
Yeah, because I don't know about you, but my experience is that nobody comes into mediation either expecting to learn anything or often wanting to learn anything.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the safest place for me to stand is on the things I feel certain about. So even if privately parties may be a little bit more open to learning something new or seeing it from a different perspective in the room with the other party, part of the way that we as human beings all cope with anxiety is to cling to the things that feel safe and certain. And those are the things I'm sure I'm right about. And as long as I'm clinging to that, I'm not that interested in, that little island over there that I might be able to swim to that might actually be better. But I don't know that I'll survive that swim to, something better.
Yeah.
So some of it's just framing up front, which is, I think we're all going to learn quite a bit over the course of the next, few hours, just about how we got here and what might be possible. So there'll be times where you'll hear things that surprise you. There'll be times where you hear things that are upsetting or seem wrong. And because this is a pretty complex set of circumstances and history and issues. Yeah. And so a lot of what we're going to be doing over the next couple of hours in this phase is just really trying to understand it. And I suspect we're all going to learn things that were not apparent from where we sat. Certainly I will as the mediator, right? So I'm trying to establish that as the task.
Yeah.
And then sometimes if I feel like they're really stuck, what we've done is ask a quite explicitly challenging question, meaning we'll ask them to say something on this issue that feels really important to you for them to understand. And then second, can you say a little bit about something around this issue that you feel uncertain or confused about or ambivalent about?
Yeah.
And by inviting people explicitly to name something that they feel uncertain or ambivalent or confused about, they want, most of the time, they want to succeed at the task you just asked, right? Because they're the good person in the mediation. In their mind, their job is to persuade the mediator that I'm the good person and they're the problem. Like that's the implicit task for the parties. So I'm going to try, as long as I still trust that the mediator is helpful, I'm going to try to comply with that task. And that means that we'll start to put out some things that aren't totally clear to me. And then the other person, often reciprocity, means that if one of them is willing to take a risk, the other will take a risk. And if the other doesn't, I'll nudge them a little bit. Well, so that sounds like something you're pretty certain about. Are there things that you're uncertain about? So that can help.
Okay. So, I mean, I've learned something that I wasn't expecting to learn, which I think is, which I think just from this first part of the interview, which I think is very helpful. And, and I guess as a mediator, the importance of reflective practice to really understand what are our blind spots. I'm going to go away and I think I'm going to take a bit of a look at myself and think about what are some of the internal voices I've got around my own identity that might trip me up going into a mediation. What expectations do I have about myself that actually might undermine what I'm trying to accomplish or what I'm helping the parties to try and accomplish. So what are the conversations I've got in my mind about my identity? I also think how important it is to be able to frame, even though our job as mediators is to be very good at listening to what's being said and what might not being said. I also think what we say is very important. I think we don't give enough thought about what we say at the beginning, to be really clear about our role, to set some expectations, and to see whether how we can engage the parties to take them. I don't want to say outside their comfort zones, but just take them to the edge so that they work really hard at getting the most out of it. So I think. Those are the kind of key things for me that I wasn't expecting really to think about. Very, very, very useful gifts actually from that first section.
Well, and there's, if we had all the time in the world, the comment that you just made about comfort zone made me think about something, because I don't know about you, but I've encountered parties who are very, very uncomfortable even being in conflict. And it's often contributed to why they're here, because they've avoided for a long time and things have festered. But then I meet parties who actually are quite comfortable in this role of opposing the other side and being the good guy, and actually you have to push them out of that comfort zone if they're going to complexify their story and find any way forward. And those are kind of different challenges.
Yeah, it is interesting how sometimes when I encounter someone that they seem to be just composed and compliant, and I have the hunch that it's just there's something underneath that I never quite know, never quite know how to tackle that. Anyway, okay, here's where I want to go next, and I want to burrow into this because I think it's a very important topic, and that's giving feedback from a co-mediation perspective. The co-mediation model, where you come up with some agreement about how you'll approach the mediation between the two of you, and then you give each other the feedback about how you did and what you could improve on, etc., etc. And I said earlier, I think it's important, and I think I struggle with it. Even though I think I'm good at it, I think I'm deceiving myself sometimes. What is it about feedback that we struggle with? How do we do it well, and how do we receive it well?
Mm-hmm. Well, so after running difficult conversations, we spent 15 years, traveling around helping people with their toughest conversations, and we started to notice that feedback was on the list of the conversations they were struggling with pretty much 100% of the time. That whether they were on the giving side or the receiving side, people weren't giving or getting honest feedback, problems were festering, et cetera, et cetera. And so for the first 10 years, we did what everybody does, which is to help givers know how to give better, right? More skillfully or more clearly. And there's a lot to learn about how to give feedback more effectively. But what we started to notice is that we would go back to the client, 6 months later, a year later, and they were having all the same problems. In other words, teaching givers how to give wasn't helping. Organizations spend billions of dollars every year teaching givers how to give. And then one day, it suddenly occurred to us that in any exchange between giver and receiver, the receiver's the one who's in charge. And they decide what they're going to let in and the story they're going to tell about it, the narrative, and whether they decide to change. And it also occurred to us that actually if we're only focusing on teaching givers how to give, it's a push model of learning.
Yeah.
So I decide what you as my co-mediator need to learn, and I push you to learn it.
Yeah.
And maybe we should be focusing on understanding why it's so hard for all of us to receive feedback and trying to create more pull, where I would have the skills I would need to take charge of and drive my own learning to balance that out. Now, one of the first things that became apparent is that feedback really sits at the junction of two core human needs, which is that we all do want to learn and grow, and it's a big piece of the happiness research of what makes life satisfying. It's why many of us started mediating, right? Because, wow, this is a whole set of skills and things to do that are really interesting and fun to learn and practice, and it's a community that supports that learning. But the problem is that it bumps into the second human need of wanting to be respected and accepted, and in some cases loved the way that we are now. So when I get feedback from my co-mediator or anybody else, or the parties, explicitly or implicitly, who are or are not happy with how I'm handling this, it suggests that how I am now is not okay with them. So I think that there's a tension at the heart of feedback for all of us. And that isn't going to go away, but being aware of it can help me manage it a little bit. The second thing, and this has been one of the most helpful things, and I can't take any credit for it, it comes from Roger Fisher and Alan Sharp and John Richardson, who wrote a book in '99 called Getting It Done. And they pointed out that actually, although we use this word feedback, there are 3 different kinds of feedback. And the easy way to remember them is ACE. So they have very different purposes, and we actually need all 3 kinds to learn and grow as mediators and as people, spouses, parents, whatever. So appreciation says, I see you and I get you and you matter and I notice how hard you're working at this, or that you've gotten a lot better at it. Coaching is what actually helps me get better. Coaching is what I most want from my co-mediator. Mm-hmm. Here's 1 or 2 things in this moment. I had different instincts. Like, let's talk about that. Why you did what you did and what you might have tried instead. The third kind, though, is evaluation. Evaluation rates or ranks you. It judges whether you're good enough, up to standard, etc. And the problem is that we're hardwired to listen for judgment and evaluation. Do I stack up? Am I good enough? Does this person think I'm good or not good? And so even when they intend to be coaching, we hear it as evaluation. Mm. And so evaluation is the one that makes everybody most anxious and reactive. And there is a structural problem, which is there's at least a little bit of evaluation embedded in any coaching, because any coaching suggests that, well, you could have done it a little bit better.
Yeah.
You're not yet doing it as well as you might, maybe. But for me, one of the things that's been really helpful with being aware of ACE is to think, okay, what do I need right now? What do I want? And how do I ask for it so that they understand what I want? So that we don't get a cross-transaction where I was hoping just for a little bit of encouragement and appreciation, but what I get is, 12 things I need to fix, or, their disappointment that they had to mediate with me. Yeah. I screwed it all up.
Yeah, it's that sort of...
Yeah. They're thinking, can't believe I agreed to work with this person. Now I've got to fix all of her problems as well as the party's problems. And so, very quickly, one of the questions that we started using when we're coaching each other, whether that's when we're facilitating or mediating or teaching or whatever, is the question, what's one thing you see me doing, or maybe I'm failing to do, that you think is getting in my own way? Or you can contextualize it. What's one thing you think I could change that would make a big difference?
Yeah.
And it's not, is there anything? Because if you ask, is there anything? They'll say, no, you're great. Sort of. It's assuming there's at least one thing, so just pick one, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of lowering the stakes on the exchange, and you're most likely to get coaching because what you're asking is for something to improve or think about or see another option that in the moment I didn't think of.
Yeah.
And if I ask that every once in a while of various people around me, I'll get stuff to think about. And often sometimes I'll start to hear themes of things I should be thinking about and working on. And so after we do a program, we have that conversation in each direction. All right, so what's one thing you think I should change? Because I don't think we can change everything at once either.
Again, it's sort of if you can adopt that sort of frame of mind where feedback is the food of champions. Feedback's going to help you learn, grow. I don't think I asked that question at all. Not just of my partner, but my network, my friends, my colleagues.
Yeah.
And I can see how asking that kind of question would be almost like a social experiment. I'm really curious now to go and send a few emails
Yeah. Oh, and by the way, when you ask, if you ask it in person, you'll get an answer like that.
Yeah.
And you'll think, you've been carrying this around with you for years, right? Now suddenly, and you never told me before. And then what'll often happen is the next morning, you'll get an email with all the things that they thought of overnight. They're like, oh, I should have said this, not that. This is so much more important, right? And so often what people will say is, I asked my dad, who I work with, and I got this like long email. Apparently he's been holding all this stuff back. And sometimes they have, but they're really trying to help.
Yeah.
So it's been interesting to me how it enriches the conversation in a way that feels a little less threatening if I can remove the judgment from it, am I good or bad, or a little bit. The other thing is that, as you know, we care a lot about internal reactions and internal voices. It's our bent for how to come at these problems. And what we started to notice is that we all have these triggered reactions to feedback. Yeah. So when you do hear the coaching, occasionally you'll just think, well, that's true. Actually, that is something I should work on. And that's really interesting. Other times you'll think, okay, well, that's just not what happened. It's not factually true, or I didn't understand the constraints I was under, or it just wouldn't work, or it's not who I am. And we're really good as human beings at wrong spotting when feedback is incoming, at looking for what's wrong with it, because if I can find what's wrong with it, then I can set it aside and safely move on with my life, my ego intact. But if it's right, I have to keep worrying about it. And the problem is that, first of all, as human beings, we just have instant triggered reactions 3 times. Truth, relationship, and identity. Truth is, would it work? Is it accurate? Is it fair? It's all about the what of the feedback or coaching. Yeah. The second is relationship, which has to do with who gave me the coaching.
Yeah.
So often it's like, you're worse at this than I am. So, or you don't really know what you're talking about, or you totally misstepped and created that situation. But it's all about our relationship with them, what we think of them, and how we feel treated by them. Yeah. And then the third is identity, which is it implicates the story I tell. Yeah. And sensitivity to feedback varies hugely, like 3,000% in terms of how upset we get and how long it takes us to recover. So the short answer to what to do about those triggers is that the fact that I have a triggered reaction isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning of the story. Yeah. Because there'll always be something wrong with all the feedback I get. So I'm asking myself 2 questions. What's wrong with it? That's very satisfying. Go out for a glass of wine with a friend, make a list of the things that are wrong with the feedback of this person. But then I have to ask, okay, is there anything that might be right about it? Is there anything for me to learn here? Because 90% of it could be wrong, but that last 10% might be actually exactly what I need to start thinking about.
I mean, it's very similar to the question earlier we talked about. How do we get engaged parties to see it as a learning conversation?
Yes.
It's almost like, so what are you certain about what's right?
Yeah.
What are you ambivalent? So those are those 2 sort of polar opposites, but it's encouraging you to think, to go in that direction, even if it's just momentarily. If this was to be true, if there was a part of this that was remotely possible, what would it be?
Well, and this is one of the beautiful things about mediation, which is that it is such a rich and layered process. Because the parties are having a difficult conversation with each other. They're often having a difficult conversation with you. The parties have feedback for each other about why you're terrible and should change. And by the way, they have a lot of feedback for you as the mediator that may not, is often explicit, but can be very implicit. It's unspoken, but you feel it, right? And then you've got your relationship with your co-mediator, which also has difficult conversations and feedback embedded in it. So it's such a, if you take a lens to it, there are so many layers at which you've got stuff going on, which I think is why we as mediators find it such a fascinating lifelong learning experience and such a rewarding profession.
How do we get useful feedback from parties?
Yeah. Well, I think the same question is helpful. I mean, because the parties have a particular set of interests, and what their interests are, I want this to be over and settled.
Yeah.
Right? So that I don't have to worry about it and spend any more money on it. But I want to be able to explain it to everybody else, and I want them to be sorry, hurting, understand how horrible this was for me and the impact that it's had, whatever it would be, right? Depends on the particular dispute. And so their assessment of your performance often is, to what extent did this mediator help me achieve my purposes and my interests? And some of that is process interest. So often they will have really helpful things when I've asked them that question, and I will ask it periodically throughout. Sometimes what I do is I'll ask, because we often have multiple conversation sessions, right?
Yeah.
And so often I'll ask them privately, just it'd be helpful for me just to do a quick check-in with you, and maybe I'll do it on an index card, or maybe we'll do it as a quick conversation. But is there one, and this is one-on-one if it's a conversation, is it helpful for me to know, is there one thing you're particularly appreciating about this process or how we're handling it? And what's one thing you would suggest I might change that would be helpful, that you think would move us in the right direction? And I don't say helpful to you in getting what you want, I say that would move us in the right direction. And if I ask the parties, whether that's both or all, if it's multi-party, that question, just have them jot it down on an index card and give it to me at the end of the day. It gives me a window into what's going on with them. Whether I agree with it or not, it's what's in their internal voice.
And does that come under, so you've asked two questions, one which is the appreciation.
Yeah.
Is that second question, is that an evaluation question?
It's a coaching question. What coaching do you have for me? What's one thing you suggest I might change?
Okay.
Now, the temptation, I think, for all of us is to ask an evaluation question. How am I doing?
Yeah.
And this is the coaching I have for a lot of the way feedback is set up right now, which is about evaluation. How many stars do you give this mediator, right? Or at Apple, which we've done a little bit of work with, they have an app, of course, for leaders, and the app taps. You can decide to tap a few team members at any point in the process, and they use it. But the question that it asks is, how am I doing as a leader?
Yeah.
And I said, well, this is great that you have an app and that you're using it, but it's asking the wrong question. Because if I find out how I'm doing is 2 stars out of 5, that doesn't tell me what to change.
Yeah.
It should be asking, what's one thing you particularly appreciate that I should keep doing, and what's one thing you would suggest that I change? And that, you don't have to agree, but that would at least give you more useful information, because it would give you coaching, not evaluation.
Fantastic. I mean,
and it feels less threatening too, by the way.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And this sounds such common sense, doesn't it? Yeah. When you're talking and going, yeah, it's obvious, right?
Yeah.
Why, but why don't we do it? It's well, you've said why we don't do it.
Partly why we don't do it, and it's hard. So I don't know if you've noticed this, but we don't really write one idea books. So I have a little pet peeve about business books. They're basically one really good idea.
Yeah.
And 300 additional pages.
Yeah.
So we kind of overcompensate in the opposite direction, which is we try and learn everything there is to understand about a topic, like difficult conversations, and then feedback, which is why it takes us 15 years to write a second freaking book. But then the book itself is like chock full of, things that like I forget about. I forget about the and stance. I'm like, oh, right, the and stance. I use it instinctively, but I forget to teach it.
Yeah.
Because it's embedded in just this huge collection of experiences and insights and all of this. And I learned that really from Roger Fisher and Bruce Patton, and then Doug at the Negotiation Project, which is hand practitioners, a huge toolbox.
Yeah.
that we can all use and keep building through our whole careers, because it's a lifelong process.
Yeah. Sheila, these have been, I mean, these interviews, I tell you, that they're partly self-indulgent. I mean,
It's all about you.
It's all about me. But no, I think it's incredibly helpful. And mediators watching this interview now, I imagine, are all committed to learning, growing, developing. They all acknowledge that there is a gap between where they are and where they want to be. And I think we got to take responsibility about getting there ourselves, taking responsibility of our learning. I love the idea of pulling, not pushing. Because actually, it's about accountability. It's about taking responsibility for our learning, for our improving, but also how effective we are. I think I found this incredibly helpful just for my own development. So,
yeah, and thank you. And can I say one thing as we close? I think it's, when I look back at the first how many years I've been doing this, 20 some years, the places I've learned the most have been the most painful. And so I think all the skills in the world can't sidestep the fact that feedback and failing or making mistakes or making the situation worse, even for a small amount of time, is incredibly painful learning.
Yeah.
So we can talk about all these skills, and they are actually incredibly helpful. But as a mediator and trying to help other people with their conflicts, I've learned the most from the places where I've failed. And I think when you see people talk about it, it's easy to talk about the successes, but what's important to talk about are the failures.
I think that's very, very poignant. Sheila, if people want to find out a bit more about the work that you do, your books, even reach out to say thank you, what's the best way of doing that?
So I am really easy to find. It's the advantage of having a unique name online. So the Triad website is triadconsultinggroup.com.
Okay.
Doug and I also have an author website with resources. On both websites, there's a nav called Help Yourself.
Okay.
And it just has case studies and preparation worksheets and articles and things like that. And our email addresses are there. And we actually love hearing from people. We love hearing from mediators, because we're all on this journey together, trying to help people with their problems, whether those are international relations or contract disputes or family businesses or families and children. And I think it's a work with an enormous amount of meaning, and if we can help each other do it better, that's what matters.
Wonderful. Sheila, I'm going to be the first to say thank you. Thank you very much. It's been a really insightful conversation. I've got loads from it, and I've no doubt people watching this have as well. And reach out to Sheila, say thank you at the very least. And those worksheets, very, very useful. Difficult conversation ones, just to kind of help you kind of consolidate your thinking, think about things, go to places that, as you say, sometimes it's the most painful experiences that we can learn from most. But if we can go there ourselves, if we can take responsibility, then we can all learn, grow and develop.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila.